and welcome to Two Old Psychologists Talking About Stuff with Ray. Hello, Ray.
Hi, Rich. Good to see you.
And me, Rich. So this is part two, really, of a kind of two-part piece that we were doing around the psychology of working with the self. And we're going to get into a much more practical discussion this evening about if you're someone who struggles with self-worth or self-related thoughts, we're going to hopefully help you out. Before that, of course, though, we are going to spend a bit of time just catching up. Being old folks, we are not up to the minute with everything. We don't do this weekly. This is a monthly podcast. And so it's a little while since I've spoken to Ray. So it's always nice to just check in. So what have you been up to, my friend?
Been up to a few things, but the most recent was great excitement in the very small market town that I live in. We had a weekend history festival, I suppose, basically a celebration of that town during the English Civil War, when we had lots of history reenactors descend upon the town for the weekend, which was, well, for me at least, was very exciting.
Life in the fast lane, right? This is how, it's better to burn out than to fade away. Live fast, die young. This is Herefordshire at its most cut and thrust, right?
It really is. It really is. I'll make an admission up front that I've always had an interest in that period, like the mid 1600s. But we've been very busy with other things, like having a career, getting involved in doing therapy stuff, family and whatnot. Not really spent a lot of time looking at it, reading about it, thinking about it. More recently, it's come a little bit more into focus again for me. So finding out we've got these folks who really specialise in this particular time in local histories was something I found myself looking forward to, probably a lot more than I'd choose to admit. When the weekend came, with very heavy rain and wind, still managed to have a fantastic time.
Do you know, the one thing I always notice about, I can't say I'm acquainted with historical reenactors, but on the odd occasion that I've been at events where they have also been present, what always strikes me is what an incredibly happy bunch they seem to be.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, other than just giving the tourist spiel about my little bit of sort of Herefordshire, Gloucestershire border, that was kind of one of the things I'd noticed was not just they seem a happy bunch, but, people often talk about finding your tribe. I think that goes on, and we've talked a little bit about that before when we were talking about being a fan of things. But I think people also kind of construct their tribe, or we might say construct their niche, the area they fit into. And we seem to have a group of people who have a genuine interest in history, like hanging out together, love basically descending somewhere and camping for the weekend, sampling the local beer and cider. It seemed to go on quite a lot. As well as, I think one of the sort of real hallmarks of it, certainly for a lot of the people there, was a genuine joy in communicating. So although it was fascinating watching people actually reenact the battle and how the muskets worked and the cannons and all that kind of stuff, what I was more interested in was talking to a few of these people who'd really found their particular role within it. But then, and this was the bit I really liked, took such joy in explaining it to me and these folks, as well as doing the big battley things. You're going to schools and really get people in connection with the way ordinary people would have lived their lives then, far more than the history books probably will. And I think that was one of the things that really appealed to me. And what about you, Rich? What have you been noticing?
Well, just noticing being a bit depressed by everything. I think it's sort of brought into sharp focus by the murder, I suppose, of Charlie Kirk, the right-wing podcaster, influencer in America. I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to American politics. I follow it quite closely. And as much as there are probably 0 points of kind of agreement between my worldview and Charlie Kirk's, there was something quite chilling about him being murdered in the midst of doing probably the only thing I could really admire him for, which was getting out and debating people. You couldn't accuse him of living in an echo chamber, right? He used to go to sort of left-leaning states and left-leaning college campuses and debate people, have debates about political views. And as much as obviously the death of somebody who leaves behind a wife and children is just horrible, the reaction to it on both sides has been awful. I think, in terms of
Mm.
people just wanting to make political capital out of it. People celebrating his death,
Mm.
um, and then people having very one-sided conversations about who to blame for it, as if this is like a brand new problem, and it isn't. You know, this political violence seems to be on the increase across the states, probably as a function of increasingly polarized and adversarial politics. It feels like it's only going in one direction, and I don't quite know how, as a society, we sort of rescue it. It feels like, I know we've touched on this before, that the increased
Mm.
polarization in particular, I think, probably fueled by social media and just the echo chambers that everyone seems to live in these days. Yeah, I just noticed it being a bit depressing.
And I think that's a depression that's shared very widely. Absolutely, Rich. You know, for people of all sorts of political opinion and people reacting to different sorts of reaction from, yeah, you're right, from people sort of celebrating or being somewhat happy about that event through to people whose political views would be far more aligned with what his were, who, you know, very, very actively making use of it, you know, kind of like rubbing their hands and being able to make great capital for it and push things forward there, you know. So, yeah, across the spectrum, just not good times.
Yeah, and in some ways maybe relates to our topic, because it would be foolish, I think, to kind of view a topic like the self and people's identity as if people just exist in a vacuum. You know, of
Mm.
course they don't. Much like you said last time, with your sort of theatre metaphor, that you know the theatre's on a street and there's lots of other things on that street too. Yeah, each one of us is an individual, but is also a, you know, part of a greater society. So, yeah, well, we're not going to solve the ills of the world tonight. So let's just crack on with what we said we would do, which is to come back to thinking about the self. I think the starting point for me, partly as a brief recap, but just sort of setting the scene, is that I think there are different versions of truth. And I think we touched upon this, but most people, when you think about what's true, the word truth, most people will think about a kind of an absolute kind of truth, as in the things I'm saying match up to the observations one can make about the world around us. So, like the t-shirt I'm wearing is black, for example. Acceptance and commitment therapy and contextual behavioral science more generally has a slightly different version of truth. And so you'll hear us folk probably talking about something called pragmatic truth, which is more about whether something works or is helpful. So the truth of something is in its utility. So a clear distinction to be made here, I suppose, is between perhaps traditional cognitive therapy, where when I learnt that, if somebody produced a thought that was unwanted, let's take a self-related thought to stay on topic, but something like "I'm worthless," for example. I was taught that you should ask, well, you know, is it true? So, like, where's the evidence? Whereas when I learned about acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, I was taught to take a different approach, really, and to sort of interrogate that question more in the sense of not so much as is it true and where's the evidence, but is it helpful? Like, does it work? If you listen to that thought, does that help you pursue the kind of life that you want to live? Does it help you or harm you with regard to your aspirations and values and goals in life? I don't know if I've made that clear enough. Obviously, it makes sense in my head because it's an idea I've lived with for a long time. But as I've said that to you, does that sound clear? Is there anything you'd want to add or take away from that in order to sort of help the audience understand this distinction?
No, I mean, that very much matches my understanding of it, that there is, it's not that there's a battle between different ideas of what truth should be, whether it should be some absolute verifiable statement about the state of the universe versus is this something that's a useful way of looking at stuff that moves us forward in our lives? It's very much just a question of what's useful in this situation. So, for instance, is that radiator incredibly hot? It might well be, we might well argue that the absolute truth of that or not is useful information. Whereas in other situations, I'm worthless. If we get into battle about the truth or otherwise of that statement, as we have both observed many times in people, sometimes we just get stuck in that battle.
Again, we always come back to this thing that you've got to see things in context. So I don't think we're saying that looking at things in an absolute truth kind of way is completely useless. It's useful. It's just that our major focus, I think, when we're working with people is not to kind of get into a big debate with them about whether their thoughts are true. It's more useful for us to concentrate on whether those thoughts are helpful and whether listening to those thoughts and aligning your behavior with those thoughts is helpful.
And I think one of the challenges, particularly for new ACT therapists, is that feels very counterintuitive. It's very difficult to be sitting opposite somebody who's having a really hard time, who says something like, I'm worthless. And you as a human who've also listened to their struggle and what they've been through and what they've managed to achieve despite all their disadvantages in life. What's, for me at least, screaming in my head is, oh, that's not true. You are worthwhile because you are you. All of that kind of stuff's echoing around in my head. And sometimes it's not helpful to go down that road because many people have probably tried to persuade that person of their worth before, and here they still are opposite us. So I think for the new ACT therapist particularly, one of the great struggles is to be able to pause, notice that urge within yourself and choose a different way of responding, given arguing against the person, whether an external person's arguing or that person has been arguing against that belief, seems not to have worked before.
I tell you what, one of the reasons I think why it doesn't work, and I would endorse that. I think trying to get into a discussion about absolute truth with people who are sort of denigrating themselves doesn't work just because of, if you're saying I am worthless, you're saying me and worthless are equivalent. And so if you attack worthless, you're also attacking me.
Mm.
And so I think what I've noticed, and it's been a while since I've done this because it's just not really the way I would work anymore, but in the days when I used to try and sort of do that whole, well, it's not true. That's not true about you. I would find it really hard to kind of get anywhere with that because people would cling to that sense of themselves, because as unpleasant as it might feel to experience I'm worthless, it kind of makes sense to people. There's a coherence to it, and it's part of them, if not, all of them. I think people who've lived under that kind of cognitive oppression for a long time, it's sort of like it's written through them like a stick of Blackpool rock, and if you try and undermine it, you're undermining the person. And that's why I think it doesn't work. So it feels for me much more useful to invite people to kind of stop and notice the kind of things they're saying about themselves and think about the utility of listening to that, or the utility of allowing that to be the guide. So yeah, it comes back for me to, is that helpful or not?
And I guess a large part of that is helping the person notice it when it shows up. Because yes, some people that we meet, it's absolutely front of their head all the time. And some people that we meet, it emerges during a conversation, during a kind of therapy setting. But it's more like it just permeates everything. It's that, and we've used this metaphor before on this podcast, it's like it's the water that people are swimming in. So it's very hard for people to notice it. So there is the noticing, oh, look, what's present here. And then, as you say, beginning to think of, when that shows up, what do you find yourself doing next? And how's that working out at the moment in order to construct the possibility of a different route onwards, even though that thought will no doubt still show up at times.
The extension of this for me, and this will come as no surprise to anyone who's familiar with my work, but I think it does come as a surprise to lots of people when I say it, is that I refuse to have conversations with people about self-esteem. I just think it's a concept that has very little utility, because it comes from the idea of, think about the etymology of the word, like esteem, it's from estimate, to judge, to evaluate. And what it involves is an estimation or an evaluation of the entire self. And sort of traditionally in therapy, what we're taught, I think, or what you can derive from the way the conversations go is that people who have problems in this area are generally talked about as they've got low self-esteem. And the answer to that is to sort of try and give them high self-esteem. So it's like to go from this global negative judgment to a global positive judgment. And that, surprisingly, given pop psychology seems so obsessed with the idea of self-esteem, has got a very poor track record in terms of evidence and outcomes. But boosting people's self-esteem just doesn't really help because it's so kind of fragile. You know, you can write a positive affirmation and have it on your shaving mirror that I'm amazing, I'm a wonderful person, and that's great. You know, when everything's going fine around you, maybe that's great. But the minute things start to go badly for you, that's the least accessible thought that you can have. Right?
Yeah. And if it is accessed, it will tend to elicit a certain response. That response will be adversarial. You know, it will be, oh no, that's not true, is it? Yeah, but what about when? You know, and the more we try and reinforce it, but I am okay, the sharper the mental response of, oh, come on, who are you kidding? Who are you really kidding? Kicks in. And, you know, what we paradoxically end up with is the person who's dug further into exactly the position we were trying to help them argue out of because of that natural yes-butting, we might say, of the mind.
Yeah, there was a big study, a guy called Baumeister back in 2003 did a huge kind of systematic review of self-esteem interventions and basically found that they just had no demonstrable impact. They didn't help you feel better about yourself in the long term. They didn't make you a better person in terms of relationships or leadership. And conversely, they were just as likely to promote kind of narcissism and a lack of personal responsibility. You know, if you genuinely think about people with really, really high self-esteem who just think they're amazing in every situation, no matter what happens or no matter what they do, like those are not people you want to hang out with.
They're not people you want to hang out with, and they're not people you want in positions of great political power. And arguably, one of the things that we're seeing looks from the outside like that. Now, of course, we don't have access to the middle of these people's minds, and it could be that there's a huge Wizard of Oz, do not look at the man behind the curtain thing, and this is all bravado, and inside the person is quaking and feels negligible. And some people that we do come across, as you say, have this excess of what we might call self-esteem, and that doesn't work very well either. Filling up the self-esteem meter is not really a great metaphor for what's most helpful in therapy.
Yeah, I think I mentioned last time, I do have my name on the front cover of a book called the Mindfulness and Acceptance Workbook for Self-Esteem. Absolutely did not want to call it that, but the publisher said, you've got to call it that, otherwise you just won't sell any copies. Because it's one of those concepts that really sells. So I think it's kind of, you know, anxiety, depression, anger, self-esteem, those are the kind of things that sell. So yeah, you open the book and immediately it tells you why it's not a book about self-esteem and why that the whole concept isn't helpful. And it's very much a book about self-acceptance.
And in fairness, Rich, I remember at the point you were still writing the book, sitting down with you and Joe, who's your kind of co-author on it, and you were bemoaning the fact that the publisher was insisting on this. And I remember even at the time saying, the thing is, if that's the lay assumption, if that's what people are thinking out there, you can't ask people to step outside that until you've given them a reason to step outside it. So you've got to meet people where they are, with the constructs they are, and then gently lead them by the hand towards a different way of looking at it. And that happens quite a bit, actually, particularly in our fields, because diagnostic entities like depression, generalized anxiety, things like that, within this acceptance and commitment therapy approach, we don't find those the most useful ways of looking at stuff. But because that's where people start, that's how they're going to search for a book on their favorite bookseller. So if we're genuinely going to help them, we've got to be hanging out in that territory in the hope of then sort of leading them by the hand to a different way of looking at it. So I don't think you've got anything to berate yourself about there.
Well, I think it's very in keeping with what we're talking about, right? That what we did there was something that was helpful rather than something that was true or right or correct as far as we saw it. So if we're not going to be talking about self-esteem and we're not going to think about people in that kind of one-dimensional way in terms of just like low or high self-esteem, I think it's probably fair to briefly cover the way we do see it. And we see it in behavioral terms, right? Because ACT is very much a kind of behavioral model. Without giving people a lecture on relational frame theory, which would decrease our listenership probably fairly rapidly if we got too geeky about it. The story that's told, and this is based on some research that's been done in the labs. The way it works developmentally is that children develop a kind of sense of self gradually, and it's one of the first discriminations they make is between I and you. So they do these amazing experiments with language, which sort of go something like, I have a red brick, you have a green brick. Which brick do you have?
Green. Sorry, I didn't realize there was going to be a quiz.
Oh yeah. So yeah, congratulations, Ray. You've managed. You've passed the sort of level that 3-year-olds can do. Can you do this bit though? So like, if I were you and you were me, which brick would you have?
Red.
Right. So kids are about 3. They can do that, and they can do it with reversal. So they're starting to realise that you and I are different, and then later on they start to add in more complexity, like here and there. So if I had a red brick here and a green brick there, which brick would I have if I was over there? So I'm not going to ask you to answer this because I don't want to embarrass you.
Oh, thank
But,
God.
but by the age of about 10, kids can reliably do a sort of mix of I, you, here, there, now, then. And so what we get to, without boring you with all the details, is this sort of sense of I, here, now. Like if we could behaviorally think about, well, what is the self? It's this sense of I, here, now. Like that is the place that I always experience the world from. No matter where I am, where I go, I take I, here, now with me. And I can make discriminations between, I, here, now, or you, here, now, or I, here, now, and I, here, then, as in like yesterday. And, hopefully you can start to see how difficult the world would be to navigate if you couldn't make those discriminations. And so in terms of behavior and language, that's kind of how we make sense of a sense of self that's different from other individuals. Again, I'm going to sort of stress test this because I know this makes sense in my head, but do you think that's clear enough for the audience?
I think we've made a good start there. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And so I'm going to leave it to you then to describe selfing. Why do ACT folks talk about selfing as a behavior? Because I guess to the average person on the street, that just sounds weird.
It does sound weird. And I think for that reason, sometimes we just kind of like find ourselves fitting in with more traditional ways of talking about the self. The reason for occasionally using this odd word selfing is basically to emphasize the idea that this is something we do. So taking a perspective, adopting a perspective, noticing these stories, these rules, these experiences, being aware of ourselves as a context in which all of this is happening, stuff we talked about in the previous episode with this theatre metaphor. All of those are actually things that we do. We may do them repeatedly and it may be habitual. They're things that we do rather than things that exist that are sitting there waiting to be found. And at one level, that sounds like a fairly pointless discrimination. I guess, of course, it's a thing that you do. But if we listen to a lot of the ways that people talk about this stuff in society as a whole, there are implications of what we're saying that are somewhat different. So the idea that a true self is something we innately have, that is some sort of fixed quality of us, becomes less tenable, or should I say less useful, which is kind of good news when therapeutically we're working with people who have perhaps a sense of self, a story of self that is leading them into more problems. The flip side of that is, again, just like with self-esteem that you've been talking about recently, where we can hit problems is there's also a lot of, very positive and very kind of empowering talk that happens to be couched in your true self, your one authentic self kind of language. And I can see the utility of that in some contexts. However, if that becomes too ingrained as that's just the way the world is, there is this thing which is a self and it is how it is, and that we're not an active part of that, we just are, it becomes much harder to start thinking in terms of holding that sense of self a bit more lightly and saying we may have choices about how we respond to different aspects of it. And certainly recognizing that there are many, many stories of self rather than just this one true, authentic thing.
So when does selfing become a problem? So I guess when we say selfing, we're talking about the way we relate to ourselves. It's kind of like the behavior of relating to yourself. So, and I guess again, we're thinking about people who hold views like I'm worthless or I'm unlovable or I'm useless.
Mm. I'm damaged goods.
Yeah,
It's a classic one in therapeutic context, isn't it?
yeah.
Horrific things have happened to a person earlier in their life, and that has led to a conclusion that they are damaged goods, worthless, whatever, and that is, as you said before, like written through them like black tool through a stick of rock now, and there's no way around it.
One of the things I think that's fascinating is just the amount of control over one's behavior that a thought can have. So, if I was living my best life and having a great time and engaging in lots of reinforcing activity whilst having the thought I'm worthless, maybe it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But the problem is that people who sort of genuinely believe that they just lack any sense of worth, that thought seems to have a massive degree of control over their behavioral repertoire. It's like
Mm.
of all of the things that they could be doing, they're not doing them because I'm worthless is sort of running the show and telling them that they can't. So that, they're not dating or they're not applying for new jobs or whatever it is. There's all sorts of opportunities out there in life that they just won't take because I'm worthless tells them that they just can't and those things aren't for them. So
Mm.
for me, that's why it's a problem. I think it's because the the thought exercises an enormous amount of control over people's behavior and hugely limits their life so that people are living a kind of much smaller life than the one they otherwise could have.
Absolutely. And again, it's not that the thought is something like a little sort of, I don't know, tumor or something that's in there and eating away at the person. The thought or the thinking that way is part of the person's attempt at making sense of their world, their inner world and their outer world. And why do we attempt to make sense of our inner and outer world? Well, two reasons. One of which is it's implicitly rewarding for the world to be coherent and to make sense. So we just do it anyway, even if there's no practical implication whatsoever. Humans tend to try and make sense of things. And then the part two is it also gives us ideas of what we should do next. And particularly in a world where subtly different things are happening to us all the time, we can't necessarily work out from first principles what we should do in any given situation that makes sense to us in a certain way. So what do we fall back on? We fall back on the rules that we've evolved over our time or been given to us or that we've noticed. And so a rule that says going out and getting a job is a thing that good people do or worthwhile people do or effective people do. I'm none of those things. And therefore, I'm not going to do that stuff. The way in which the belief or the thought or the self-story influences behavior is often mediated by the rules that people have constructed around that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think like a lot of undesirable or unwanted thoughts or feelings, we can go to extraordinary lengths to keep them at arm's length, so to speak. But almost without knowing that you're doing it, you can kind of construct your life in such a way that you don't have to come into contact with worthlessness. So, I guess the sort of classic is that like I'll take no risks, right? I'll just keep my life really small and safe. And if I stay inside of this tiny life, then I don't have to confront worthlessness because this sort of small life is kind of manageable. Obviously, that's a double-edged sword because as comfortable as it might be in there, people do then miss out on, adventure and curiosity and all of those other kinds of rewards that might be there if only you could step outside of what's comfortable.
Just as you're saying this, Richard, it's the first time it's ever struck me. I'm reminded of that pinnacle of modern art, which was the Disney version of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which in many ways is not the high spot of film history. However, does include the line, at what point does a sanctuary become a prison? And I
Nice.
think we're in that territory.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why they call it a comfort zone, of course, right?
Mm,
Comfortable.
mm.
And, the minute you step outside, it gets uncomfortable. So people, there's a pull to want to stay inside, and yeah, it's a prison in many ways, isn't it?
And of course, that discomfort might be being avoided not simply because it doesn't feel nice, but it's kind of been associated with danger and threat in the past. So there's a kind of a survival element to saying, I've got to stay small, got to stay under the radar, not because it might be a bit tricky to push out there, but because a learning history has said, if you put your head above the parapet, you're in danger. And that got in so deep and so early in a person's life that they haven't even articulated it, let alone questioned it. Or, as we would say as behaviourists, had the chance to test what the consequences are.
Mm.
So, in talking about people's reluctance to move out of their comfort zone, you and I and others using this approach, we're kind of very well aware it's not just about people being a bit soft or a bit self-indulgent. There are big, powerful forces within person's histories that shape that behaviour. And yet, it still can be a great act of liberation if we can find a way that's safe and that's achievable for the person to begin to sort of broaden that repertoire of behaviours and sample some of the things that might matter to them that their self-protection has denied them so far.
Going back to what you were saying earlier, if someone says, I feel worthless, and you go straight in with, oh, that's not true, it's very invalidating, right? Because the feeling of worthlessness is the reason why people aren't doing,
Mm,
perhaps more adventurous things with their life. It's why they want to stay safe and they want to stay within their comfort zone. So if you just wade in with, that's not true, you're not worthless, it's sort of like, it's really invalidating of all of the choices that they've made. It's quite unkind in many ways. I think
mm.
people's intention is kind when they say that kind of thing, but it doesn't land as kindness. It lands as, oh what? So I'm just a coward then? I should be having a much bigger, more adventurous life because
I'm a
the reason I don't is just not true.
yeah, that's just saying I'm a different kind of failure then, which, yeah, doesn't help.
I think the point I just want to double click on though is that there are probably, and this is based on the idea that, like, I don't think anyone does this on purpose, right? No one is going to get out of bed in the morning thinking, right, how can I assert my worthlessness today? It's that's just not how it works. People don't come to these views out of choice, right? That they come to them through, often very difficult experiences of trauma or some combination of unfortunate genetics and parenting and socioeconomic circumstances or whatever. That I think, like, kindness should always be right at the forefront. So I might say something like, I can see that you see yourself in that way, and I don't want to take anything away from that.
Mm.
And I want you to know that I don't see you like that. That's
Mm.
very different from my experience of you. You can invite some gentle perspective taking, like to ask somebody whether the view they have is shared by everybody. Um,
Mm.
what might your partner or your children say about you, for example, if there were a kind of older, wiser version of you who'd kind of come out the other side of this. I wonder what if they were looking back at you now, what they might say
Yeah.
about you right now. So I think there are some ways of gently questioning that
Oh,
are kind
yeah.
of kind and that don't imply any sort of blame.
And that aren't adversarial and that
Yeah.
aren't even assuming kind of we're right. Isn't it interesting, though, that those perspective takings that you're just talking about, how they map straight back onto that very fundamental stuff about how selfing begins? Because we were talking about these dimensions of selfing, the I, here, now. So I versus you, or I versus other, here versus there, now, present versus then, either future or past. And actually, beautifully, the examples you gave of compassionate perspective taking were actually varying by those. So I versus you. If there was another who you care for, who was a decent person you respected, and they were looking at the situation, what might they say if they were here? And then if you were sitting across the room listening to yourself say these things, what might occur to you? How might you respond? So that's like I there now. And equally, that you of 10 years in the future, looking back, or I there then. Some of the most natural ways of doing this perspective taking, completely unintentionally, but actually I think it's just built into the underlying physics of it, map onto those dimensions of selfing of I, here, now.
Yeah. I'm going to take issue with unintentionally because I think I'm not to big myself up here, but I think that because well, maybe I do, and I'm bigging you up at the same time because I think most skilled ACT therapists are saying that kind of thing to the untrained ear. It probably just sounds like, oh, that person's being really lovely and kind, but
Yeah,
I
okay.
think from a therapist point of view, there's a reason why you say certain things. And that's not to say that they're not genuine, because I would hope I never say anything that isn't genuine, but I would choose my words carefully,
Yeah.
and
I
that's
think when you say that, and when I say that, we probably have this, the technical term for what we've been talking about as this really weird name, deictic framing, but this I, here, now business. I suppose the point I was making about it being just in the underlying physics of it is when you listen to people from somewhat different therapeutic approaches, from sort of more purely compassion-based approaches or person-centered approaches, they will often come up with exactly the same exercises. And they will cite those. And they haven't had to plow through this endless purple book of relational frame theory and struggle to get their head around this stuff. And yet it comes naturally to them to say, what would a compassionate other person who you respect say? If you were watching yourself do this, what might you say to yourself? I mean, we didn't invent those. They arise very automatically from this model, but they arise automatically to lots of other models too. I guess that was the point I was making.
Sure, yeah, no, I'd agree with that. That's one of the interesting things about all the various different kind of groups within psychotherapy that they'll like to argue with each other at conferences. When you get them in the room, a lot of what they do is the same. They just have different theories for how they got there. Mindful of time, and I want to get on to some sort of helpful
Yeah.
techniques for people. I just wondered, just very briefly, is there anything you would want to say about your line of work and how this kind of, issues with identity and self might show up with
Yeah.
people that you see?
Yeah, absolutely. I think over the years, the stuff we've been talking about, the selfing business, and some of the things I've been touching on around rules and how we act on the basis of those have become a bigger and bigger part of what I'm working with, particularly with people whose lives have changed and whose lives have changed for the worse for whatever reason. It might be bereavement, it might be illness, it might be a change in personal circumstances. And very often, what I hear from people are phrases like, I'm not the person I used to be. I think people say that sort of straight out, I'm not the person I used to be. Well, if that's not a comment on self, an altered sense of self, I don't know what is. They may be more specific. So in bereavement, if somebody's lost a sort of long-term partner, sort of the love of their life, they may very well be saying something like, I've lost half of me. One of the metaphors that I was talking about somebody just the other day is like if it's been a very long-term relationship, two trees that have grown together. And the shape of each has been sort of an interaction with the shape of the other. And if one of those trees then dies, then you can see in the shape of the person who's left the impact. So things really have changed. And some aspects of I am a parent, or I am a partner, or I am a footballer for the person whose career comes to an end, or a teacher. And some of that stuff, from an objective truth perspective, we're not going to argue with. It would be unhelpful to argue with. There are several things that in helping people in that situation we might do, but one of them that's around the self is I get people to reflect on this idea that there is a you that is bigger than any one of these stories or identities of yourself. There's far more to you than footballer, partner, intellectual, whatever. And how I do that in practice, I tend to use a visual aid, which is a large and very crudely drawn, basically gingerbread person. So lots of space inside it. And get people to begin to put into that all the stories, identities, whatever we're going to say, that make them up. And, in whatever therapeutic context we're in, the one that's involved in the difficulty is probably the one that's going to be biggest and more central: a teacher, a husband, or whatever. And some of those things might not be possible anymore. And then what we begin to do is write in some of the other things, like soap opera, dog owner, and helping people to see that it's not that those aspects of self that have changed forever are insignificant. In fact, we need to mourn them. We need to grieve for them. And we notice that there is a you that is bigger than all of that contains many other selves, if you want to put it that way. And that, looping back to what we said last time, is that sort of you as context. And we can move attention around and choose to focus on different bits that will bring us into contact with different of our values. But so this visual aid of the gingerbread person, as simplistic as it sounds, is an act of diffusion and an act of building an observing sense of self within session. So that's one I use quite a lot. What about yourself, Rich? What are your kind of go-tos for this kind of work?
Well, there are several, and obviously it depends on the situation, the person, and where they're at. But one of the things I think I return to a lot is the idea of a container metaphor. A classic is the idea of the sky and the weather. So that I think it's a Buddhist phrase, and it goes something like, "You're the sky, everything else is the weather." And so it's the idea of trying to help the person see that you're the sky, so you are the place where the weather happens. Because the thing about the sky being different to the weather is that the sky is kind of constant. It's like the container, if you like. It's the place where the weather happens. And so if you're the sky, your thoughts and feelings and urges and values, they're like the weather. So and like the weather, they come and go. They ebb and flow and they change and they are quite dynamic. But the sky is always there. It's a constant. So it's kind of like you're bigger than any thought or feeling that you might have. And if I can sort of help people to relate to their experience that way, and that leads into kind of subtle language things that I might introduce. So if someone says I'm worthless, we kind of add in something like I think we talked about this last time, but like I'm noticing that I'm having the thought that I'm worthless, because that brings in all of those kind of container features. You spoke about your theatre thing last time. We discussed this in the relation to that. But yes, it's that container idea. I think the other thing I use a lot, just to sort of circle back, is perspective taking. And that's, again, the reason for that is to kind of like pop people out of their I hear now perspective. Because if it's like from here, I've got this thought drumming around in my head, it can feel incredibly compelling and incredibly accurate. And it's this, worthlessness, for example, is an accurate description of what's going on for me. But to sort of try and invite someone to see this familiar thing, this I am worthless, but from a different place. So to take a different perspective on it, I find that helpful to try and, to shake things up a little. If someone can consider that actually their friend or their relative sees the same person that they're seeing, but they just see them completely differently, and worthlessness isn't part of what they see when they look at that person, it sort of has to call into question that this is just a viewpoint, right? It's not a fact. So if I can say something like, I see a lot more than worthlessness when I look at you. I see you, and I see that you have this thought about your sense of worth, and I see all these other things. I see this funny, entertaining, kind, compassionate person who I kind of enjoy spending an hour with every week. It kind of forces people, I think, to just, reconsider that this worthlessness might just be a perspective rather than a fact.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, that would be something. Would you be up for doing something if it like a kind of another little way of demonstrating this?
I'd be up for that.
It's going to involve you revealing something a little vulnerable about yourself. So you can, feel free to back out. But
Mhm.
do you have one of those kind of I am statements that it kind of runs around in your head and gives you a bit of a hard time?
Yes, I lack self-discipline.
Okay. So I want you to imagine that we could kind of locate this thought in you somewhere. This is going to sound a little weird, but I'm just going to ask you to go with it if that's all right.
Happy to.
So I lack self-discipline. Like if you just sort of kind of meditate on that for a minute, like where does it show up somewhere physically? Does it occupy a space in you?
I notice a kind of bit of a heaviness across the shoulders when I think about it.
Okay. Now even more weird, like imagine we could kind of take that heaviness out of your shoulders and we could just put it on the table and we could look at it. What does it look like?
I guess it's kind of black and tarry, sort of treacly.
Okay, so can we just sort of picture it on the table there? So it's black, tarry, treacle-like substance. Is it forming a kind of shape or is it just poured out? What does it look like?
Well, it's like, I don't know, like some sort of like TV special effect. It's just this kind of amorphous sort of flowing into whatever shape's available, smothering things.
Like the policeman from Terminator 2?
Yeah, but less shiny.
Again, if I could invite you to take a sort of even weirder step, like imagine somewhat like the policeman in Terminator 2. It was sentient and it had kind of aspirations and motivations. What do you think it wants for you? So like I guess there you are trying to do something. I'm guessing it shows up in times of importance, right? Where there's you're trying to do something that matters to you, and then this thing shows up and it sort of weighs heavy on your shoulders and it says you lack self-discipline.
Mm.
What do you think its motivation is? Why does it do that in those moments?
Well, I think it wants me to be able to do the stuff I want to do. And it's
See,
just exasperated with me that sometimes I dither or distract myself or fail to focus.
kind of wants you to see things through.
Yep, see things through. Not in some sort of kind of grandiose businessy sense, achieving goals, but just, if it was worth doing, you want to do it.
And do you want to see things through? Do you want to achieve the things that you're interested in doing?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't set out to do them else.
So it's sort of like you and it are on the same team in many ways then.
I mean, I guess we are.
Like it's not the enemy.
No.
Like here it is, this strange black, tarry, treacle-like thing. It's got an aspiration for you to kind of stop dithering and get things done. Perhaps when you at moments where you're trying to pursue something important but you lose focus, it shows up and says, "Hang on, look at you, lacking discipline." So, I mean, we can agree it's got a terrible bedside manner, right? Could be
Absolutely.
much kind of kinder about the way that it reminds you of the importance
Mm,
of focus and getting this thing done. And it is at least aligned with your values, even if it has a funny way of showing
mm,
up. Similar to the thing we were talking about earlier about this kind of container idea, it's like, so there's you and there's it. And like it is a part of you in terms of it's like a part of your experience. It's part of what you think and feel.
mm.
I wonder, is there any way you could kind of accept it, rather than railing against it and sort of seeing it as something bad or terrible about you that you needed to change? Like, is there any way you could just sort of, you could pick it up from the table and just put it back on your shoulders and go, okay, all right, you again, and almost be kind of grateful. Like, I'm glad I have this part of me because even though it's not always comfortable, it's trying to keep me on track.
Yeah, I think the focusing on it wanting the same thing does give me that element. And I guess what's different is that when it shows up, normally that's a cue to beating myself up a bit. And and that if anything is counterproductive, that gives a bit of a, oh, see, look, I knew I couldn't do this. I knew I couldn't focus this hard. I'll just go off and read for a bit or make another cup of tea or whatever, and actually kind of focusing on the extent to which it and me both want to do this thing, not because we want to be superhuman, but just because this was an important thing we set out to do. Maybe it can be a kind of a cue to sort of settling in and saying, come on, let's crack on. Let's actually do this. This isn't about whether I'm the kind of person who can do it or not. Let's just get on and do it. Yeah, I can imagine trying that, certainly.
Okay, thanks, Ray. I really, really appreciate you doing that from cold. I kind of sprang that on you a little.
You did indeed.
Is there anything you would want to say just by way of reflection? I mean, I think that little exercise there kind of embodies self-acceptance. It's looking at a part of you that you don't like and that you'd perhaps react against, or maybe even give yourself a hard time for even being there. And what that encourages you to do is to work towards accepting it and responding to it in a helpful, constructive way rather than a sort of unhelpful, destructive way.
Yeah. I mean, what my reflection would be that, I don't think it's the most unusual thing for a person to carry around. And, years of either saying, yeah, I'm a terrible person for being like that, or equally saying, no, I'm going to say, and I've got some stuff done over the years. That's a rubbish thought. It's just not true. Frankly, if either of those had worked, this wouldn't happen. So the acceptance that it's always going to be a part of me. And you can move forward with it rather than making one way or the other, defeating it, the precursor to feeling like you're doing a reasonable job at things.
So I feel like we've got to a point where we've laid our stall out in terms of thinking about an act approach to the self
Yeah.
and demonstrated and discussed a few useful techniques that maybe people listening can incorporate into their lives. I'm going to leave the sort of last word to you. Is there any sort of closing thing you'd want to say?
I think the closing thing I would say is just loops us back to the start. Nothing we've said is in a literal sense true. If what we're interested in is absolute truth, what scientifically top trumps, how does a water molecule work? It's not that kind of truth. What we're actually talking about here is here's a way of looking at stuff that seems both to fit other things that are known and seems to lead to useful outcomes. And from this way of working, that's kind of enough.
Yeah, I did say I was going to leave the last word to you, but I feel like I want to underline what you've said. I mean, I think that this way of working, I mean, obviously we're fans and advocates of it, and it does have something like 1,500 randomized controlled
Mm.
trials and about 500 meta-analyses and systematic reviews suggesting that coming at unwanted thoughts and feelings from the perspective of bringing mindfulness and acceptance and values driven behavior change, that does seem to be an effective and useful method that certainly
Mm.
some people can make good use of.
Yeah. At the very least, as useful as any other way, and helps us approach some things that sometimes are trickier from another perspective.
Sure. Okay, thank you. So we're going to launch on a lighter note into the traditional section of the show where I ask you a random question. You all set?
All set.
Let's go and ask Ray, shall we?
In fairness, I think the bit about this being on a lighter note was probably not wholly accurate. So anyway, we'll leave you to judge this. Your question is, how do you think the world will end?
I think there's two distinct ways of answering that question. It depends what we mean by the world ending. I think this rock orbiting the sun probably not going to end until science tells us the sun will expand and eat it up in a few billion years. I don't know if that's true, but seems reasonable. I think how will current humanity's world end, our habitation of this planet? I guess I tend to be on the pessimistic end of that. I don't think we're necessarily going to make it out into the stars and forever. I think as a species, we have the seeds of our own destruction one way or another. And I don't think it'll be with a big single bang. One of my very favourite authors is a guy called William Gibson, and he wrote a post-apocalypse story where he referred to something called the jackpot, which wasn't one big thing like a nuclear war, zombie apocalypse, asteroid strike. It was this whole load of smaller single things that just added together tips humanity over into not really being viable in the long term. So on this, you're quite right, incredibly depressing question. My suspicion it will be something like a gradual tipping over into whimpering through environmental change, wars, etc., rather than a single big event. But who am I to know? What's your take on it, Rich? To completely cheer us up.
Boringly, I think I kind of agree with you. And there is a part of me that struggles to get really animated about environmental issues, purely because I just think the world will be fine. You know, the world will be absolutely fine. If we manage to wipe ourselves out and do a whole load of environmental damage in the process, the Earth will recover. You know, you've only got to think about how quickly vegetation takes over a disused building site. You know, within a few years, there's just trees everywhere. And so I think that ultimately the world will be fine. Yeah, I have less faith in humanity being fine. And there's a part of me, this may be a terrible admission, but it's a part of me that's not that bothered about that. I think if we can't get it together to look after ourselves and look after the planet that we live on, then maybe the planet's better off without us. So yeah, I kind of think, yeah, the Earth's going to be fine one way or the other. We may damage it to the point that we can't live on it anymore. And that's terrible, of course, for us. It's terrible for other species who are going to suffer through a result of our actions. And life always finds a way.
There we go. Maybe any residual octopuses will make a better job of it as they evolve through to becoming dominant and fully sentient.
The residual octopuses is a great name for a band.
I agree.
When we finally get bored of doing this podcast and go to Plan B, which was to form a band.
Which was the middle-aged men's band rather than the middle-aged men's podcast. Yeah.
Ray Owen and the religious octopuses. What was it?
Residual.
I've forgotten it already. Maybe it wasn't such a good name. Yeah.
Maybe it wasn't.
Okay, well, thank you very much for another entertaining and informative discussion. I will see you again next month. You take care, my friend.
I look very much forward to it. I will see you then.